Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your blessings. We believe that you would speak to our hearts today. Guide us as we study your word and draw us ever closer to you. May we understand what you have in store for us and keep us ever under thy care and in thy presence so that as you speak to us, your word will have meaning for us and we will order our lives accordingly. So I pray in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. Okay, so let's continue. We are in Revelation chapter 17. And so today we go back to our screen, if you will. We at part three of our session that we've been doing. I think we've covered a lot of material thus far. So today I want to sort of lay out the land for you again. We are going to look at a quick review, as we've been doing all the time, a quick review of the major symbols and headlines. So I'm not going to get into some of the slides we used in the past in terms of the summary, but we will use some of the old slides just to give us a quick insight into some of the major symbols and headlines of Revelation chapters 12 to 16. We will take a quick overview of chapter 17 in terms of how it's laid out. We started that last week. And then we will repeat very quickly what we have looked at with respect to the summary vision, which is in verses 1 and 2, and then the scarlet prostitute and Babylon that is introduced to us in verses 3 to 6. And then we'll move into the riddle of the scarlet beast, which is something that we encountered last week, and we'll spend some time doing that today. We talk about the beasts and the kings because we are told that the 10 heads represent 10 kings, if you will, and then we talk about 7 mountains, which we think are 7 different nations. We will be looking at the battle between the beast and the lamb. We won't spend a lot of time here because it's just one verse that speaks around this. And then we will finish off with the battle between the woman and the kings and peoples, and then we will prepare for look ahead, if you will, to Revelation chapter 18. So that's our focus for today. In looking at our summary, um, I wanted to emphasize, if you will, that there are a few things that clearly comes at us, right? In Revelation chapter 12, if I talk about major symbols and headlines, we encountered a woman, a child, a dragon, and a remnant, all right? Then in Revelation chapter 13, we encountered a sea beast, a land beast, an image of the beast, and a mark of the beast, right? Those were kind of the main topics that emerged in chapter 13. We got to chapter 14. I know some of you forget that it begins with the story of the victorious lamb in the Mount of Zion with 144,000. So we introduce a lamb. We talk about 3 angels. Then we talk about Babylon again as part of the 3 angels' messages. And then we conclude our talking about 2 harvests. Chapter 15 was more an introductory chapter to chapter 16. So I didn't really put a lot of big things here. But you know that in chapter 15, we are given the timing of the 7 last plagues. When we get to chapter 16, we are looking, if you will, at the first 5 plagues as some of the main headline events that are taking place here. And then we talk about the river Euphrates, if you will, the 3 frogs, and then Babylon destroyed. So let's quickly run through these things to make sure we understand what we are talking about. In the case of the woman that was introduced in Babylon, we were clear that that woman represented the church. We pulled some Old Testament references, just these two from Isaiah and from Jeremiah, where God often referred to Israel as a woman who he loved and who had forsaken him, etc. But clearly, the representation of the woman represents the church of God, who God loves, right? And that was what we discussed. The child is pretty straightforward. The child we know to represent Jesus Christ, who was, of course, born of a woman, but that's not necessarily the representation here. We say that he came out of the Jews, which was part of God's church at that point in time, if you will. And it was out of that that the child came forth. The child reference in Revelation chapter 12 refers to Jesus Christ. The dragon, um, the chapter itself identified that the dragon is the devil. All right. But we also said that the devil works through human agencies. He works through entities, nations, and kingdoms, etc., upon the earth, and political elements, etc. So in this case, the dragon in Revelation 12 worked through pagan Rome, or civil Rome, whatever we wish to call it, but the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was existing when Jesus was born, and it was the Roman governor, the Roman emperor, who wanted to destroy all the young men of Jerusalem, of the Jews, and therefore wanted to kill Jesus Christ. All right? So the dragon used Rome in its civil form to effect the work of the devil. All right? So when we talk dragon, I want you to keep that in your head because we'll encounter that as we explore chapter 17. The dragon is indeed the devil, but understand that the devil will sometimes activate, use, manipulate human agencies to get his stuff done. We introduced our remnant, which we said is really a remnant of the woman, meaning that there's a last day church that will come up sometime after 1798, which is after the Roman church was wounded through the French Revolution, if you will, and that the last day church will be identified by the fact that they keep all of God's commandments and they have the gift of prophecy. And of course, we will come to this in a bit. They also proclaim God's final message to the world. All right? So we begin to have an appreciation, if you will, for Revelation 12. It introduced us to a woman, which we said is the church, a child, which we said is Jesus coming out of the church, a dragon, which we said is the devil, but he worked through a human agency, which was civil Rome at the time. And then that the dragon is after the remnant of the woman, which is the last day church of God, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. When we got to Revelation chapter 13, we encountered a sea beast, right? Something, a beast coming out of the sea. We said sea is synonymous with water, and water, as we know in Revelation 17:5, 15, sorry, water represents people, all right? And we also remember that in Jeremiah, he talked about Babylon as the river Euphrates, a place of plenty people. So the vision is the sea beast, if you will, is represent a nation that comes out of a place of plenty people, and given its activities and what is described in its activities, we are well in concluding that civil Rome and more so religious political Rome during the 1260 years from 538 AD to 1798 is represented by the sea beast in Revelation chapter 13. All right? We summarize that to say that it will receive its power from Rome, because you know civil Rome gave Christian religious political Rome its power. It would be a worldwide system of worship. It would speak blasphemy. That came up again. We know we encountered that in Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 9 when you talk about the little horn. But it comes up again in Revelation chapter 13. So again, that helps us identify that we are talking about religious political Rome, which is the version of the Roman Empire that emerged after 476 AD when the barbarians would have invaded. And what we found was that while civil Rome declined, religious political Rome ascended. All right? It would be a persecuting power. That is how it is represented, because so much persecution. It would reign for 42 months, is what we read in Revelation chapter 13, 1260 years, and it will have a deadly wound, which was when the church was stopped by the French Revolution, if you will. And it will carry the number of a man, which we says is a number system that is more man focused than God focused. And therefore 666, while we can make very specific references to the titles of the head of the Roman Church, it is more valuable, if you will, to consider it as we did when we looked at Daniel chapter 3 and we saw the golden image that was based on a 60 decimal system where it was 60 cubits high by 6 cubits wide, etc. That in number is indicative of man-made um, religion and man-made doctrine as opposed to God doctrines. All right. So that was the sea beast. We then said that we will encounter a land beast. We had quoted extensively then from Stefanovic in his good book called Pure Revolution, and he said, while the first beast had a terrifying appearance, the second, in contrast, has a harmless appearance. It is lamb-like. On his head are two lamb-like horns, in contrast to the sea beast that had 10 monstrous horns. The lamb in Revelation is exclusive symbol of Christ. This shows that the end time nation that emerges out of the land, a place where there is not a lot of people, has a Christ-like appearance and appears friendly towards God people. In other words, it promotes religious liberty and civil liberty, which we said represented the two horns. All right. So when we looked at that, we said it came out of the earth, an unpopulated place. It looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. It's a peaceful nation at the beginning, but it acts with violence. It gives authority after the deadly wound of the first beast, and it still has authority after being healed, right? So it's given authority to the first beast, if you will, and we will talk about that, and it performs great signs and wonders. We pulled a very powerful conclusion that says that the lamb-like beast is representative of the United States, and this is when the United States makes its entrance, if you will, into biblical prophecy. So we see that in Revelation chapter 13. This is a summary. We did that in detail before, but I think you appreciate that that is when the United States is introduced, if you will, in a very specific sense in biblical prophecy through Revelation 13, as we discussed the lamb-like beast. We then said that the image of the beast is really a re-emergence of church and state, if you will, and that during its heyday, during the 1260 years, the Roman nation in its religious political form represented a unison, a coming together, if you will, of church and state through one leader who was then able to exercise both civil and religious powers, but in a way in which it was done, the persecuting nature of that power is emphasized more than anything else. I'm not saying that that's the only thing that the nation did. Certainly, a lot of good things would have happened in terms of their evangelistic expansion and being all over the world and stuff, and the rise of the church in America, etc., the Protestant movement. But the reality is that its persecuting power is what was identified in the sea beast nature. Of course, after the French Revolution, there was a demise, if you will, of that union of church and state. Republicanism became kind of the fashion of everybody, and they pushed a separation of church and state. It was exactly where we are today. One could argue that the dominant approach to governance today is separation of church and state. Um, and then what we are saying in Revelation 13 is that towards the end of time, this image of the beast, this representation of church and state coming together, civil liberty and religious liberties being curtailed to produce forced worship, the message of the prophecy that is still to be fulfilled. So we are careful about being too dogmatic around it. But I'm saying that the general acceptance of all commentators who have adopted the historicist approach to the interpretation have clearly landed on the fact that what is anticipated, if you will, is a future state where church and state comes together again. Churches and the church, the governance of the church together with political power will come together. And the output of that, if you will result in further forced worship, forced worship around symbols and symbolism that is not aligned to the pure scriptures, similar to what it was in the Dark Ages period during the 1260 years. All right. Um, we then introduced the topic of the mark of the beast, and we said that that really must be a sign of the Roman Church authority. And one of the biggest signs of the Roman Church's authority is Sunday worship. It was something that was introduced, if you will, by the Roman Church, and has gained popular practice all over the world. All right, and again, there are many documented research papers around the fact that this originated under the Constantine era when he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. All right. So we basically said that towards the end, the central issue that will emerge would be worship. All right. When we got to Revelation chapter 14, we also came upon the fact that a lamb is being introduced, which is Jesus Christ, and the fact that he would be victorious. So before we got anywhere, we were talking about the fact that God will be victorious in this great controversy. Revelation 12 sort of introduced us in a very, very intimate way with the great controversy between Christ and heaven and Lucifer. We were told about a war in heaven. We were told about Michael and his angels standing up, and that Lucifer was cast down to the earth with one third of the stars of heaven, meaning the angels of heaven. So we were introduced to that in a very graphic and a very spirited description, if you will, in Revelation chapter 12. But before the angel goes on to, and God continues to explain and expand on his prophecies to John, he reinforces in Revelation 14, chapter verse 1, that the Lamb will become successful. It's important to establish the win, because what he will reveal later on would sound very grim and very, very hard to follow. But the fact that the matter that he's assuring that there will be victory in the Lamb makes it a little bit more palatable in terms of being able to accept it and to deal with the reasoning to understand what is taking place. We, of course, we introduced the three angels, and we said that while the symbolism here is about three angels flying in the midst, literally, when it is translated, it is not necessarily um, about literal angels, but the fact that the word angel in its original Hebrew incarnation really refers to messenger, because all of the angels are messengers of God. But in a large sense, this is referring to God's people who are upon the earth during this period of post 1798, that they would be occupied, if you will, with preaching the everlasting gospel. So let's be clear that the fundamental message of the church is the gospel of Jesus Christ. We talk all this prophecy and stuff because we try to understand the other aspects of the Bible. But the fundamental message God expects his last day church to preach is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the fact that he is worthy of worship because he's the creator, and the fact that he will bring all this to an end. So to a large extent, when we talk around the prophecies, we try to make sure we hit those key core concepts, because that is kind of where we are as we go forward. We also introduced Babylon again in Revelation chapter 14. We talked about the history of Babylon being formed from Nebuchadnezzar, but even going back to the days of the Tower of Babel, and then Nebuchadnezzar, and how he would have had real prowess, if you will, as a leader. We talked about the fact that Isaiah prophesied the fall of Babylon, and that is earthly Babylon, literal Babylon. So when Babylon is used in an end time context, we're not talking about literal Babylon within the Middle East or Iran, if you will, or Iraq, but we are really talking about spiritual Babylon, or a symbolic Babylon, something that emerges, that you could say behaves like and looks like ancient Babylon in the way it approaches its governance. All right. So by John's time, there was no literal Babylon, and therefore Babylon represented a great, again, this is a lot from the commentators we have pulled here, represented a great alliance that would be against God and his true believers, right? So the fact that the second angel's message is telling us that Babylon is fallen is giving us an indication that, notwithstanding this emergence of what looks like a very powerful force, this behemoth who is going to go forward and try to really be like a juggernaut upon the earth in terms of its control, God is saying that that system of governance that is united between church and state to force worship and to create persecution and drama, that will come to an end. All right, it will fall. Even as he reminds us at the beginning that the Lamb would be victorious, he reminds us that this false religion would come to an end. So we concluded, if you will, that end time Babylon is really united and aligned with national and state authorities and government. It promotes religious practices that are not aligned to biblical doctrine. No surprises here. We saw this during the Dark Ages period. Again, I remind you that when Luther posted his 95 thesis, it was theses, if you will, it was 1517, which was really in the heights of the Dark Ages period, which did not come to an end until more than 200 years later in 1798. It trivializes God's role as creator in terms of rejecting the seventh-day Sabbath, which was given really as a reminder of God's creative power, and then it forces religious compliance through economic and other penalties, if you will, around those who are against it, economic sanctions and force of governments, etc. Right? Neither buy nor sell, etc. So, in summary, then we could say that Revelation 13 is giving us an insight into a confederacy of religions attempting to unite church and state. And that is something, again, not being dogmatic, but recognizing where the prophecy is pointing to something to be expected in the future. All right? So that is kind of what we covered up to 14. When we got to chapter 16, we encounter these first five plagues, which we said seem to be representing literal events, but even if they are not literal, for figurative representation, it still signifies a terrible period. All right. So we talked about sun and water turning into blood and streams and sores, and then darkness and pain around the beast itself, meaning around the system of false religion and forced worship, etc. We then introduced this whole concept in the sixth seal of the river Euphrates. We went back to what happened in Daniel chapter 5. We talked about Belshazzar and the fact that the kingdom of Babylon was undermined by the drying up, deliberate drying up, the diversion of the river Euphrates, and that the soldiers of Cyrus the Mede were able to the Persians, sorry, Cyrus the Persian and Darius was the Mede. So Cyrus was able to infiltrate Babylon, if you will, by using the dry up riverbed to get in, right? So we say that that is a representation, if you will, of something that will happen in the future. And then we discuss the fact that Revelation 17:15 tells us that the waters represent people. So that basically we are anticipating some period where this governance structure that will receive popular support from the world and from the leaders of the world, at some point, that popular support will dry up. It will be withdrawn, if you will, and that will create some drama, if you will, and it will create a response from that system of governance, which is a response that we think will be filled with climatic and miraculous events, almost as if to convince people that they are real. Something that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24 and 25 when he said it is possible even the very elect will be deceived. So that's something we need to be prepared for. And then given the fact that the beast or that system of governance can no longer protect the people because it itself will be exposed to one of the plagues, the fifth plagues. We sense that there is going to be some drama and a real battle to win back the following of the people. All right. It is in that context that three frogs were introduced, and we said that as a way of counteracting what seems to be this loss of popularity, there would be a coming together, if you will, of three frogs, if you will, as a counterfeit of the three angels' message. The three angels' messages were meant in Revelation 14 to rally the saints of God and the people in preparation for Christ's coming. One begins to sense that these three frogs, and we went through all the interpretations that are prominent around this, and we deduced very clearly that it represents spiritualism, which is the dragon himself. And we know that there's a lot of spiritualism in the world today. It represents the church in its resurgence, if you will, the Roman church in its resurgence from the days post 1798. And then the Americas, if you will, which is the home of Protestantism, It's a coming together of these three forces to create a governance structure, if you will. So there's going to be a resurgence after the drying up that occurs for a short time, but ultimately all of this will be destroyed. Christ will come a second time, and Babylon, that system of governance, will find itself coming to an end because Christ himself will come. It's just what his seventh plague is all about. So that was our summary, if you will, of the major topics that we covered in Revelation 12 to 16. If you're uncertain about any of these, I would really recommend that you spend some time with the YouTube videos and just go them over, because we spent a lot of time over the last few weeks covering and months covering these areas. And I'm sure that we can pick that up as we go forward. And we got to Revelation chapter 17. We recognized that it followed a particular pattern, which we were able to disaggregate as we continued to study. So there was an introductory scene, which was really a very simple scene where an angel was saying to John, "Come and let me show you so many things that will come to pass." Right. So that was the introductory scene, an angel bringing John to it. There was a summary, a very brief summary of the vision, which we'll talk about again today, in verses 1 and 2. And then we were introduced, if you will, to again that term Babylon reappeared. We talked about a prostitute, a whore riding upon the scarlet beast. The prostitute is also dressed in red and purple. So we'll talk about that. And then we encountered a riddle in the verses 7 to 8, because they talked about the beast that was, is, and is to come. And it seemed very cryptic. And you had to figure out what it means. So we'll talk about that today. And then it talks about the beast and the kings. So again, no secrets here, but clearly we want to understand what that means. Beast is a kingdom. Kings obviously means kingdom, but we've been using beast insofar as it refers to those kingdoms or nations that would have oppressed God's people. So when we talk about kings, we're thinking about the other nations of the world, if you will. We are assured of a victory when they fight against the Lamb, similar to what happened in Revelation chapter 14, and it began with an assurance, and then there's a further explanation. So that is where we want to get to today as we go forward. So let's begin with this summary, which we looked at last week, and I'll just go it over again for making sure you are intimate with where we are as we go forward, right? So the verse 1 and 2 basically says, "Come, and I will show you the great harlot who sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication." So we introduce, if you will, to a woman. If we said in Revelation 12 that the woman who was standing upon the sun with the moon and the stars, etc., represented the purity of God's church throughout the ages, not necessarily is a religion, but just God's church from the beginning, from Adam and Eve all the way to now. Then the impure woman, or the harlot, which is a phrase that was used repeatedly to describe Israel in the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, etc., when God would say that Israel's adventures with the heathen nations around them, he considered to be fornication, because he had seen them as his betrothed, and he had seen Israel as a nation that he loved, and he would bring. And a lot of the prophets, especially in the book of Judges, when they talk about Israel, they talk about the fact that Israel strayed from her true God and her true lover, which was God their Father, Yahweh. All right. So clearly, the harlot then represents the people, the church, if you will, it's in pure state. And it seemed to be suggesting that this impure church not only is defying God, but is able to commit fornication with the kings of the earth. So there's again this inference, there's again this invocation, if you will, of church and state coming together that is represented here in chapter 1 and 2, right? And the inhabitants of the earth. So not only this is speaking to a bigger picture here, it's saying that not only is the woman, the impure church, the church representing doctrines, behaviors, practices that seems to be at odds with what God expects in the Bible. Not only is this impure church finding alliances with the heads of nations, but she is enjoying, if you will, the following of the inhabitants of the earth. So it's a popular form of governance, if you will, that will emerge towards the end that has popular support. Revelation 13 talks about the whole world marveling after the beast, and they wondered after her and they followed her. So this is simply echoing that, which is consistent with what we have studied before, right? So we talked about the fact that the impure woman, therefore, represents the apostate church, if you will. Um, and the church is in union with many other churches, because it's not just one church is really, we'll come to that in a little bit and we talk about that, right? So the angel states that a prostitute, and she's called Babylon, she dwells upon many waters. So we come back to that term waters again. We are quoted from Jeremiah 51, and not just Revelation 17:15, but Jeremiah 51:13. And we think that waters represent peoples, if you will. All right. So it's really talking about the people of the world, if you will. And we're saying that if the prostitute sits upon and dwells upon many waters, it is invoking, if you will, an image of governance, an image of control, so that the doctrine and the thinking, and actually the Bible uses the word seduces when it talks about wine and stuff, right? We'll come to that in a little bit. So clearly, the world is seduced, if you will, by the false church and follows almost blindly what the false church has to say. All right. So in verses 3 to 6, we encountered, it says, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." We've seen that word before, blasphemy. We know that that occurred in Daniel chapter 7 when we talked about the little horn. We were clear then. Matter of fact, the Bible itself gave us the answer, that the little horn represented the incarnation of the Roman nation in its religious political form, which was primarily during the Dark Ages period. This is a historical fact. All right. So the fact that that is happening, we are immediately reminded of that. And we need to understand the 7 heads and 10 horns. We'll come back to that in a bit, right? But he describes the woman, he says she was arrayed in purple and scarlet. She was adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. And then she had in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and blasphemy are seen synonymously to represent things that are anti-God, that are not what God expects, if you will, and the filthiness of a fornication, which is again very vivid language to suggest that the woman is able to develop alliances, if you will, and arrangements, and work consistently with the people of the world to achieve her abominations and the blasphemies, etc., that is taking place. All right. So upon her forehead, verse 5 says, was her name written. So that's when the Babylon concept comes in, mystery, Babylon the Great. And then it uses an important term, the mother of harlots. So that is an important term, because we said that the church here is maybe not just a single church, but to recognize that it is representing, if you will, all religious beliefs, if you will, that are aligned to the mother church in terms of its belief structures and what it is proposing and what is being followed as abominations of the earth. All right. And then he says, I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints. So the persecuting power of that beast that is emerging, that kingdom that is emerging, is again, we know that there was a persecuting arm of that church and state that occurred in the Dark Ages period, and we're keeping that in our head. And with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, it may not just be the Dark Ages period, because remember, John is looking ahead now, and it is suggesting that that is also something to come. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. All right. So we remembered from Stefanovic a few quick things. He says that in the ancient time, prostitutes wore scarlet clothing and lavish ornaments for seduction. So the fact that she is portrayed in seductive attire is indicative of the fact that the impure church, because we says the impure woman, if she's called a harlot, means she's an impure church. The impure church is seducing. It is basically creating a space where it encourages others to follow what she says, and that is important. And then he also reminded us on the right hand side that purple was also used for royal attire within the Old Testament writings. So once she's arrayed in scarlet and purple, he's basically saying this is not just a church that is seducing, but it is a nation. And we know that that period occurred in the Dark Ages period, and it seems to be suggesting to us that that will reoccur again in the future, where we find this nation state aligned with church and state, if you will have royalty, will have nationhood, and will have that sort of power going forward, right? Um, there's an important point here that Stephanovich makes that I find to be interesting, because that just kind of reinforces the church nature of this arrangement here, right? So he says that purple was also used, if you will, by the high priest, and scarlet and gold. So it was really seeming to suggest that this Old Testament invocation of the priest role is being picked up in this illustration here of this woman as a harlot, as a who is riding the beast. So if you were to distill all of this, basically we are saying that John's vision is meant to symbolize a resurgence of the church to the point where it has political influence. That political influence comes together to the point where it begins to enact, it begins to leverage power upon people in a way that is away from what God wants. And since the Dark Ages period were already referenced, we begin to think that this is something of a future nature. Having accepted that, because we looked at this last week and week before, having accepted that, if we were to represent it, if you will, you would think that the religious power is seen through the woman, and then the political power is seen through the scarlet beast. Notice that red is the common color, which suggests that there is martyrdom, there is persecution, there is the spilling of blood that's occurring through these religious alliance. All right. I made some quick points here that I pulled from some of the writings and the readings, but the key point here is to note that in this incarnation, which is why we can think of this as a future event and not the past event, right? And the past event meaning the Dark Ages period. In the Dark Ages period, the head of the church and the head of the nation were one and the same person. So the head of the church had civil power and religious power. And so when he operated, and I could say he easily got, I don't think there were any she's in those days who took on that role. But that's just the period it was in, right? So when he operated, if you will, as a head of state. He had both religious and political power, and they were homogeneously inculcated into one person. If you looked at that person, you could not definitively and separately distinguish a head of the church versus a head of the state. When you saw him, you had the view that this is one and the same. What Revelation 17 is telling us so far is that what will emerge in the future will be two separate entities, a religious power and a political power, or powers, if you will, and that they will be distinct but they will work in unison. I want us to appreciate that. That is a powerful little truth that we need to hold on to in terms of how we interpret this prophecy going forward. Because we are distinguishing two separate entities, the prophecy is basically saying that what will happen in the future is that we will have the emergence of a religious power that is obviously not aligned to what God wants and stuff, but that it will be so powerful that it will be able to seduce, hence the harlot characterization. It will be able to seduce the kings of the earth, the scarlet beast, the people of the world, if you will. And that in seducing them, both the political powers and the religious power will work in harmony. Having said that, we now need to pay attention to the fact that she is called the mother of harlots, the religious power, which says to us that we are not just talking about one church. Yes, we are saying that one church will be the piper, the leader, if you will. But by referring to the mother of harlots, we are saying that this woman has children or daughters, if you will, and that is aligned in that particular way. So the prophecy is using that reference, if you will, to suggest that they the coming together is not just between religious and political powers, but even within the religious world, there will be a coming together and a harmonization. That is not something we have seen as yet, but we are saying that that is likely to happen. What form and what precision it takes place with, we are yet to describe, but we are basically getting a big picture of what is ahead of us. All right. So it's seated on the beast. It will control the political powers and will use it again as it did in the Dark Ages to get drunk with the blood of the saints. That is the other thing to remember, that her cup is filled with blood, right? So we're suggesting that that is indicative not just of the abominations, but that the issue of persecution, the issue of sanctioning those who are not aligned is also going to arise. And we saw that when we talked about the mark of the beast in Revelation chapter 12 and also in chapter 14. All right. So um, that is not unfamiliar to us, if you will. So those were the two sections that we covered last week, and I want to move on now to the riddle of the scarlet beast. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? So look at what the verse says. It says, the beast that thou sawest. So here's where the riddle comes in, right? You know, the old age used to say a riddler, read. I can't go on to the rest of that on this platform. But anyway, so the beast, that is what verse 8 now says, right? The beast that thou sawest, in other words, you saw in the vision, was, he's describing the beast, he says it was, it is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. All right, so that is what the angel is telling John. He's saying that beast that you saw, scarlet, 7 heads, 10 horns, it was, it is not, and shall ascend in the future out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. Right? So this is giving us sort of life cycle. It's saying that this nation, because we know beast normally means nations, we saw that in Daniel when we were describing the nations using lion and bear and leopard, etc. So he's saying that this nation, it was, it is not, at some point it was not, and then it shall be in the future. So I want us to appreciate continuity here. Now, when we talk other nations, Assyria, um, Medes and Persians, Greeks, they don't exist in any form or fashion today to what we had then, right? We have a Greek now, a Greece, yes, but that is a democratic Greece and a far shadow of itself, struggling with EU issues and its own bankruptcy and that kind of thing. Far shadow. We have Iraq and Iran that occupy the places where Babylon was in the Middle East, if you will. So there's something here that is suggesting continuity of this kingdom over a long period of time. And the fact that it says perdition, perdition is really hell, which is the end of the world. So we are saying that this peace will continue to the end of the world. Now, just to keep your minds aligned, remember, I didn't put the picture here, but maybe I should have done that. Remember Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, we were introduced to an image whose head was gold, breast and arms were silver, belly of brass, feet of iron, and then the legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And I reminded you then that the iron existing in the feet represents towards the very end of time, because the stone in that vision of Daniel chapter 2, the stone that was cut out of nowhere without hands, hits the image at the feet where the iron still exists and then fills the whole world. So it is clearly suggesting to us that the Iron Kingdom continues into the very end of time. And so we need to ask ourselves, what kingdom, as represented in Daniel's vision, is still very much active today and will be active all the way towards the end of time? That is something you need to keep in your head. The rest of the verse says, and they that dwell upon the earth shall wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. And this is just simply to suggest that those who are not followers of Jesus Christ and who are not paying attention to what he had said in his word, that they would be marveling at this great beast. Presumably, those who are followers of Christ will not, because they will see it for what it is, which is the emergence of something that is against God that will eventually go to hell. All right. When they behold the beast that, and again he repeats the riddle, that was, is, and yet is, right? And then he says, here and here is a mind which had wisdom. We have seen this phrase before. When he was explaining the mark of the beast and 666, he used that same phrase. All right. So he explained it now. He says his seven heads, which is made of the beast, are seven mountains. All right. So you would say, well, that's no clearer, but it is. Because when we were discussing Daniel chapter 2, we said that the stone fills the whole earth and becomes a mountain and represents the kingdom of God. So it is normal in Old Testament language. I keep saying to you that to understand Revelation, you have to be intimate with the Old Testament writings. So it was normal. Jeremiah referred to Babylon as the mountain that will be cut down and thrown into the sea. All right, so it was normal in Old Testament times to refer to kingdoms on the earth as mountains. So by saying that his seven heads are mountains, he's basically telling John that they represent seven nations, if you will, upon which the woman sitteth. So he's also dealing with that. And there are seven kings. So then he goes on a bit further and he elaborates and he says, and there are seven kings, one and the same as the seven mountains. Five have fallen. He describes them even further and saying, five gone already. One is, so we should ask ourselves which kingdom is in a wrong when John is receiving this vision, and the other is yet to come. All right. Now we have to also keep your mind very focused on this because he is pointing out to what will happen in the future. He's explaining it to John as happened in Daniel when the angel came and explained to Daniel. And he basically says, look, you see where you are now? Our kingdom is reigning. The kingdom that was reigning when John was alive was Rome. All right, so we can say that Rome is the one that is. That is an easy one to fix by the elimination. And he's saying that there were five kingdoms before Rome, upon which the woman sitteth. If it's upon which the woman sitteth, it means there were five kingdoms that basically created some ruction and persecuted God's people in some form or fashion, right? Now, when it says the one that is, we must also appreciate that this whole chapter begins by saying, come in the introduction, come let me show you the judgment of the great harlot, right? So it is the judgment time that John has been introduced to. Now, the judgment time for the world began in 1844. Let's appreciate that, right? So basically, he's saying, when he says, and the one who is, one could very well argue that that is talking about a kingdom that is occurring around the time after 1844, after 1798 and the French Revolution, right? So we need to think about that. And then we need to say that something else is coming. So I said to you, it's Rome. I need to think about I want you to think about which stage of Rome's existence are we talking about? Are we talking about the existence of the Roman emperors, which is when Constantine and others would have ruled, and that may have been around the time of John's time when he physically lived. But if you take the cue from the start of the chapter that says, let me show you the judgment of the harlot, then you begin to appreciate that it's a judgment time we are talking about. And therefore, when you say one is, that present tense he's referring to is the judgment period, which really is the end of time that began in 1844 when Christ moved into the most holy place and began the pre-Advent judgment. All right? And when he cometh, he must continue for a short space. So he's saying that when this version of the beast occurs in future, it will be for a short time, relatively, of course, and then it should go into perdition, right? That is what it seems to mean here. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and of the seven that go into perdition. Well, this one, I suppose, loses everybody. When I first read this, I struggled for a little bit too. So we need to sort of appreciate a little bit more detail about what we are talking about here today. So let me just start by going it over and trying to clarify some stuff as we go along. The beast, of course, if you pay attention to the screen now, the beast is a kingdom. I think we're all comfortable with that, right? You know that. Once we say it was, it means we're talking about a past kingdom. Once we say it is not, it means there's a period when the reign of that kingdom came to an end. You would think that that is the end of the kingdom, but the fact that we're talking about something else after suggests the kingdom did not come to an end. It's almost as if it was wounded. I use that word deliberately. So it is wounded, it is taken for dead. That is why Revelation 13 uses the term, its deadly wound was healed. So it was wounded. 1798, the Roman Empire was wounded. Was it dead? No, because subsequent to that, by the time they get to 1929, Mussolini has granted the Vatican nationhood status, etc. And the church is certainly back in full prominence today and regaining its strength, etc. So you begin to appreciate that it was not dead, but it really appeared dead at that point in time. People wrote um, extensively, some of the philosophers of the day, that was the end of the church and the end of the church, etc. Well, that is not the truth, right? So when it says it will come from a bottomless pit, one begins to appreciate that that term abyss and bottomless pit was used when we did the seven trumpets. And it also referred to the period when, in 1798, with the French Revolution, the church's doctrine seemed to be set aside and that all the church's power disappeared. It was like an abyss, it was like a bottomless pit, if you will. So when you start to think about the fact that it shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, it is saying that it will resurrect from a space where it thought it was dead, if you will. But after it resurrects and becomes good, ultimately it will eventually go to hell and it will really be completely destroyed. I want to make sure we're taking this progressively. So I want to make sure you're okay with that. Let me just go this over again. We're saying that the beast is a kingdom. So once we talk a kingdom, we're talking a nation ruled with some sort of monarchy and stuff, right? It was, so at some point it was powerful. If I'm letting the cat out of the bag and telling you it's Rome, we can easily know that during the periods of the emperors, Rome was powerful. But by the time 476 came around with the barbarians who invaded, that was the end of that kingdom, right? So it was. It is not. There's a period when its reign stopped. During 1798, its reign certainly stopped. And it looked as if it was dead, but eventually it is now out of that period. It is certainly in an ascendancy. Popularity is on a high, if you will, it's growing. And we've seen that ultimately the Roman kingdom, like all other kingdoms in this world, will come to an end when we get to hell at the end of the day, right? Let's keep going then if we understand that. And then he repeats that same sequence: was, is not, and yet is. Now remember, I don't know if you recall, but you could do that as your homework. When you go to Revelation chapter 1, when we began this journey, and Jesus was introduced as the one who was holding the golden candlesticks in his hand, etc. He was referred to as the one who was, who is, and who's yet to come. That's interesting, isn't it? Because here was Jesus being referred to in past, present, and future. And now we have a counterfeit, if you will, of God upon the earth, who is being referred to as past, present, and future. All right. So he's saying that great kingdom, it stopped reigning for some time and it will return to its glory subsequently. All right. Then it says that the seven heads are seven mountains. So again, no rocket science here. We know that that seven mountains represents seven kingdoms or seven nations, right? And then he says, five have fallen, five of those nations have fallen, and one is. So I told you you gotta be real careful, even though I've written it here existing in John's present time. I want to suggest to you that you have to also remember that it started off talking about the judgment period. So it may not necessarily be talking about physically in John's time during AD 100, which is when John would have received most of this vision. But during the time in which the prophecy is looking at the judgment of the harlot, which is that period after 1798. All right. So we will come back to that. Just keep that little tidbit in your mind as you go forward. And then he says the other is not yet come. So basically, what we are inferring here is exactly what we said at top. It was a great kingdom. It stopped raining for some time. And I notice rain here is governance, right? Not like it's rain falling. And will return to glory subsequently. So it's saying that subsequent to that, it will ascend out of the bottomless pit and it will return to glory. All right? But then it will go to hell shortly after. So we begin to get timing, if you will, for when this resurgence will take place. It will occur just before Christ comes a second time. Because when Christ comes a second time, he ushers in perdition. He saves those who are ready, and those who are not, they go to they are dead, and then eventually there is hell and that kind of thing, right? So we know that that is where we are. And then he says, for he is an eighth, right? So, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth. So he's saying the whole kingdom, the whole entity that seems to be spanning sometime in the past, sometime in the present, and sometime in the future. That whole entity is itself a kingdom. That's what that little phrase means that I know is confusing the life out of all of you and me as well at some point. So he's saying, and he is the eighth. But that answer should really be about but is of the seven, meaning that all seven make up this entity called a beast or a nation. And that is what we call an eat, right? So that's kind of the major interpretations. I just want to keep that clear in your head. I want to make sure you understand this, right? So verse 8 is introducing us to a kingdom that was in the past that stopped reigning for a while, look as it was dead, it will rise from that dead period, but just after it rises from that dead period, it will go towards ultimate hell and destruction. So that has to be just towards the end of time. That it was, it is, and is to come is representative of its present, its past, present, and future state. The seven heads are seven kingdoms. So we're looking for kingdoms that arise that made up this whole sequence we're talking about here. We'll think about that. And that um, the eighth one is really referring to that whole system of governance that is really coming together to work against God's people. So let's take um, some clarity, if you will, as we go along. So it includes the heads that have been during history and John's time and until 1798. All right. So it's talking about some of the nations or the kingdoms that were from before John's time and into 1798. Some of them are represented here. It is not means it was not. It was fatally wounded, but it didn't die. Right? It didn't die. It wasn't dead. It was just wounded. And it will ascend means it will get its power back. So just keep these thoughts in your head. I know you still might be a little bit concerned, but let's keep it and let's keep going and see if we can get clarified. So let's go now to the beasts and the kings. What does verse 9 say, right? Because we looked at verse 8 just now. And it says, here is the mind which had wisdom. So he's coming to explain it. His seven heads are seven mountains upon which the woman sitteth. We saw that just now. And then he says, and there are seven kings, five have fallen, one is and the other is not yet. And when he cometh, that is the one who is not yet, but is to come. When he cometh, he will continue for a short space. All right, this is straight out of the Bible, right? And the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven and goeth into perdition. So he's saying that that whole thing comes to an end, if you will, and it will eventually go to hell. And then he says in verse 12, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which has received no kingdom as yet, meaning that these are kingdoms to come. So he's talking to John during the period of what should be the judgment, sometime after 1798. And he's saying that there's still some kingdoms to come. Now, when it uses 10 kingdoms or 10 kings, I told you last week that in the modern world, 10 was really meant to represent a sort of complete number. We have a decimal system of counting. After 10, we start over. 11 is really 10 plus 1. All right. So when you think about that, this 10 is also representing completeness. So it may not necessarily be 10 specific kingdoms, but it's saying that the kingdoms of the world, if you will, who are yet to come up and receive their full power and stuff and future events. We need to think about that as the 10 horns being represented on the beast. But shall receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, you would tell me that that 1 hour means you should work it out precisely. But this is synonymous with the previous representation when it says for a short time. So there is an emerging period, which we remembered in the 6 seals when we talked about the waters supporting the woman and then withdrawing, that this will happen. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. So he's saying that the political kingdoms of the world will come together in unison, united under one common umbrella, one common objective. But they will unite also with the beast, which of course represents the impure church. And in coming together, they will create this union of church and state that we have seen before. All right. So there are some conclusions that we can draw from this. This beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, which is like the dragon and the beast from the sea we saw in Revelation chapter 30. Satan controls this beast. That is something we need to appreciate, right? So that is consistent with when we said, when we looked at Revelation chapter 12, and we said the dragon is the devil. We then said that who tried to kill the man child that the woman brought forth, Jesus Christ, wasn't the devil directly, even though he appeared in the wilderness temptation himself, but he used Rome to try to kill the child. So he controls the beast, if you will, as an avatar of himself, and he works in that way. It represents all the powers that have oppressed God's people along history, and it claims it is like God, who is, who was, and who is to come, which is, I totally remember the early introduction in Revelation 1:8, but it's a little different. Before I decipher this, let me just add a few more quick points. Notice that he's saying that Babylon is associated with political leaders, but also the inhabitants of the earth. And then we describe the fact that she is the mother of harlots, which means that she is not alone as leading the religious powers, but there is a confederacy of religious powers who are uniting with national governments, if you will, to form an alliance, two distinct entities of church and state, not as in the days of the Dark Ages. It's all future events. And that is something that we need to pay attention to. All right. So we need to be clear that that is what we are aligning and how we are leading it out. And then we said 5 have fallen, and the other one is, and the other is yet to come. So the sixth kingdom is, of course, Rome. And we need to figure out what version of Rome we are talking about, which is consistent with what we saw in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Now, let me say to you that this verse is interpreted in many ways, but there are about 3 key ways that are representing what is popular in some of the literature you would read and some of the commentaries. And of course, it depends on the predisposition of the authors, whether they are futurism, whether they are practicing preterism or they are practicing historism, as we are using in our approach. The other thing is to note that it varies among commentators. So, for instance, Ellen White does not deal with this chapter in any specific way. She doesn't reveal it, she doesn't try to interpret it. But she certainly talks at length about the Roman Church during the Dark Ages period, and then the growth and resurrection and the rise of the Roman Church post 1798 and into the end of time. And she talks about alliances with America and that kind of thing, right? So she doesn't try to explain this verse per se. So it's not critical to the understanding, but we need to appreciate that others have. So when you deal with Stefanovic, who being quoted successfully here from Andrews University, he uses some other nations, which I'll talk about in a bit. Mervyn Maxwell, who wrote God Cares Too, he uses this third approach, but he acknowledged in his writings that there were others who would use the second approach. Let me just go through that very quickly. So when people look at this, these seven heads, if you will, five have fallen, one is, and the other is to come. Some people say that that represents Egypt, who clearly oppressed God's people, as we all know. The Jews were in Egypt going through Pharaoh and have Moses having to deliver them. Assyria, because remember we said the nations are drunk with the woman, right? So that false religion oppressing people is part of that. The Assyrians, when we talked about the fact that the Assyrian nation, before we got into Babylon, were some of the people who would have also been kings in the time and would have oppressed some of the earlier prophets and nations, etc. Then Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, then Greece. We oftentimes don't talk about Greece, but I mean, you had Media Persia and then Greece, etc. And then you have Rome and stuff, right? So he associates those nations to represent um, those five nations. Then there are others who feel it represents past leaders of the Roman Church. I tend to land, if you will, and if I were to act, if I were to if I were to have some sort of opinion, then I would land in the same place with Mervyn Maxwell, because he uses the kingdoms we have encountered in this prophecy series between Daniel and Revelation, and that's important. Up to now, all the kingdoms we've encountered in Daniel and Revelation have followed the sequence we saw in Daniel chapter 2. So for me, there's a little bit of incongruence to make reference to Egypt and Assyria because they were not part of that whole prophecy series that started in Daniel chapter 2 and which we've been using for almost every chapter going forward. Is that okay? So we need to kind of be consistent. If that is the case, then we have an opportunity here to define those kingdoms. If the first kingdom is Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, which was the head of gold in that vision in Daniel chapter 2, and the second kingdom is Media Persia. The third is Greece. So all of them would have persecuted God's people along the way. And then we had civil Rome, because remember, Rome now takes on different forms and functions, right? So you have civil Rome. Then you had the religious political Rome up to 1798. And then remember, I keep saying to you that this vision John is having is the judgment of the harlot. So he's in a period of time, even though physically he's existing in AD 100. The vision is basically looking into a period after 1798. Revelation 10 and 11 was also talking about after 1798. Revelation 14 is after 1790. The three angels' message is after 1798. So he's looking at a time after 1798, after 1844, and therefore what we have is Christian Rome having resurrected, yes, from its death in 1798, but not really the big power that it is, but it still exists today, right? And therefore, what we can expect in the future is a religious Rome that is now united with world powers. Now, notice I am saying religious Rome as opposed to religious political Rome because I'm making a distinction that in the Dark Ages period, we had religious political Rome coming together. In the future, yes, they will be political in nature, but they will not have the same sort of global political reach and governance that you had in the Dark Ages period. But what they will do is that in uniting, this is why the woman is riding the scarlet beast, in uniting with the world powers, they then create a combined entity, if you will, that is representative of church and state. And we call that the image to the beast. It looks like what happened in the Dark Ages period. All right. It's not an exact replica, but it's certainly an image of the beast. Everybody okay with that? So the seven heads, if you will, of the of the scarlet beast that the woman is riding, one could argue, represents Babylon, Media Persia, Greece, civil Rome, religious political Rome. Rome, in terms of its the state it is in today, which is out of the bottomless pit, out of its death kneel and deadly wound, and then ultimately we are looking towards a emergence of an entity that is really the coming together of the religious and the political rule in a particular form. Pay attention to this, keep this in your head, let this sequence make sense to you. If you go back into the YouTube channel, freeze this and watch it for a bit, and just make sure you understand what's happening. This ties us, if you will, consistently with what was being taught in all the prophecies thus far. All right. So the sixth kingdom is Rome. Um, that is the fourth beast, right? And the beast on a whole, if you go back to this slide, the whole thing, you could argue that this last version of Rome towards the end and the coming together of the will and thing represents the ultimate efforts of all of these in persecuting God's people along the way. Because along the way, God's people always persecuted through this approach, right? And persecuted for religious reasons. Like Jews were held under Media Persia, while Darius under Babylon, while Darius and Cyrus were good towards the Jews. Later on, you found that Daniel ended up in the land, then that was under Media Persia. The Greeks, we talk a lot about Alexander, but we forget that they also persecuted God's people. Civil Rome, no questions here, they killed Jesus, and they also persecuted a lot of Christians after, before Constantine, and then even after Constantine, Christians were persecuted. Religious, political Rome in the Dark Ages, no problem here. And then Christian Rome today is not yet persecuting, but it exists. And then we expect that an entity will occur towards the end. So you begin to get an impression, if you will, of what this eight beasts is really the sum total of all of this. That's why you say the eight is made up of all the seven. In other words, just this whole entity that seems to want to go after God's people is what we represent in here going forward. Now, Revelation 17:14 then tells us something very important. It says, these, and sometimes we forget that that word begins with that word these, because it is picking up on what went before. And what went before was these nations, and then this final emergence of Babylon and a beast that are coming together, and that they would go into perdition, they would go into hell in a short time. But while they are wrong, they are forming a powerful alliance. And he's saying that these two entities will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Now, there's a powerful verse. It's a verse I would think you should memorize and just learn, and let it be a form of reassurance. Because God is saying that as much as I paint this picture of this confederation that will occur towards the end, and this attack upon God's true believers and God's church and God's belief system and man-made philosophies forcing worship, that they ultimately will attack me, God himself. But God is not upon the earth because he hasn't come as yet. So who are they attacking? The person who represents God upon the earth are God's people. Again, that is consistent with what we saw in the seven seals in Revelation chapter 7. We talk about the 144,000. In Revelation chapter 14, and we talk about the 144,000. Again, this class has never said that the 144,000 are literally 144,000, but they are representative of God's last day people who will experience some degree of angst, persecution, temptation to give up on God's word, not follow him. But God will be sealing them, and sealing them means that he will be reinforcing his character in them as they surrender themselves to him and allow his gospel to take root within their hearts. That's why it's important to preach the everlasting gospel, right? So he's saying that while all this will happen, he will overcome, and that those who are called, and I want us to be very clear about that, God calls everybody. So it's really meaning those who have answered, that is what the chosen is, and are faithful. So you have heard the call, you have chosen to follow him. And when we get to Revelation 18, this becomes even more powerful Because in Revelation 18, we'll encounter a powerful angel saying, come out of her, my people, come out of the Babylonian system and follow God's true way, right? So God is calling people to follow him. People choose to follow him. And then if they remain faithful, meaning because one save is not always saved, and the expectation is that each day, Paul says, each day I die daily. He renews his relationship with God each day, and he allows his relationship with God to be afresh each day. God is able to keep us to the very end. So this is consistent what we have studied before, which is to suggest that when we got to the sixth plague, there is a battle where the Confederation attempts to attack God's people, which we refer to as our Battle of Armageddon. But we said it's not just a physical battle, but it's also a spiritual battle as well, right? Because people are tempted to give up. But thankfully, God said to us in Matthew that if it were possible, even the very elect will return. But because we are with God, we are chosen, we are faithful. You must always think about yourself as chosen and faithful with God, that you have answered the call, then you remain faithful to God to the very end, right? So just before the end, that's the last call to get out of Babylon. We'll talk about that when we talk chapter 18 next week. And to reject getting the mark of the beast, which really just means not to follow the system of false worship that will come. Those who accept his message and remain faithful for Christ are called, chosen, and faithful, right? And our victory is guaranteed because the Lamb is fighting for us. That's why in Daniel chapter 12, talking about this same period, it says, and Michael will stand up. It uses the word Michael for Jesus because it sees him as our commander and our chief who will go out and fight for him. That battle is represented in the next section, because in the next section he explains, the angel explains to John a little bit more. He said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So we accept that what we are saying is that over the years the church has used populations to inflict drama upon people, and towards the end of time, there would be this influence upon people, drinking of the wine of the wrath of a fornication, that will happen, that will cause people to turn against God's people. All right? And the 10 horns which also is upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. So remember we said that the 10 horns represented 10 kings who will come. In other words, the nations of the world. Don't get tied up in trying to look for 10 people forming an alliance or forming some EU bloc or some United Nations grouping or something. It simply means all the nations of the world, right? They will come together. But he's also saying that they will at some point hate the whore and shall make her desolate and naked and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Well, that's a powerful statement, because we said in the sixth plague of Revelation chapter 16 that the river Euphrates will dry up. And we said that that is akin to the people of the world withdrawing their support for this new leadership of church and state, and that will cause some drama for the church because they will receive the drama. It is in response to this kind of licks, if you will, that we have the three frogs coming out and providing miracles, almost as if to say, well, I am really of God and I am really come from God. But those who are faithful to God will not make that mistake. But then he says, for God had laid in their heart, within the 10 kings of the world, to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast. So they will indeed give over their kingdom to the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city. So just in case you're not too sure and you thought that this is a real woman, God is saying that that is that great city which reigned over the kings of the earth. So he's saying that that coming together of church and state, that is forcing this governance structure over the world, that is what is represented here. And we were told in the seventh plague that Babylon will be destroyed and broken into three pieces, completely destroyed, right? So these horns are seen in the context of the fall of Babylon, and they play an important role at this moment. So you can argue, if you will, that these verses are simply echoing the second angel's message when he said to us, Babylon is fallen. because that coming together of church and state to oppress the last day followers of Christ will eventually break up and mash up because they will attack each other and fight each other. So they will come into play during the plagues, and they are clearly identified as the kings of the earth. All right. They initially support Babylon and fight against the people of God. However, they eventually detest her and abandon her during the fifth and the sixth plagues. All right. And as I said, that is where we have this darkness around that. And then we have the three satanic powers, the three frogs, if you will, persuade them to fight against Christ and his people again. All right, so that is what we've seen in verse 17. All right, so he's saying even though they would fight her in this point, this is verse 16, they fight her for a while and destroy her. What will then happen is that they will come back again and give over their power to the beast. So there's really a short sequence of some quick events that are taking place here. And that is what we've attempted to explain by looking at all this together. So we have looked at Revelation chapter 17. That's introduced, if you will, a harlot riding a scarlet beast. And we have said that that harlot is the impure church, but it represents the impure church more towards future events, and that the seven-head beast represent the seven kingdoms, with Rome taking up about the last three or so in its different forms, as civil Rome, religious political Rome, and then Rome in its current state today, and eventually emerge as a powerful nation again. And that in coming together, they will align, if you will, to try to persecute God's people. But there will also be a period when the people of the world will pull away their support from this new governance structure to come. But after some time and after some miracles, that the thing will the governance structure will manifest, they will eventually come back and support her in trying to destroy God's people. But they will not be successful. Revelation 17:14 says, the Lamb of God, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords of the hosts, he will overcome. So you could argue, if you will, that Revelation 17 is a magnification of this fifth, sixth, and seventh plague in some detail. And as we get to 18 and 19, we'll have even further magnification to what we've had today, right, up to this point. But it's clearly given us a look ahead, if you will, as to future events. I keep repeating to you that when we deal with future events, we are very, very careful, because we try not to be dogmatic, and we try not to sound with any great degree of precision. But we have enough presented to us in the scriptures where, if we make the correlations back to what we've seen happen in the past, we have a very general sense that what will emerge towards the end would be a return to this uniting of church and state, albeit as two distinct entities who will attempt to pass laws and attempt to govern the world in such a way that if you are not aligned, you'll be sanctioned with physical penalties or economic sanctions, all right, either by yourself. And that in doing that, at some point in time, as God intervenes into this sequence of events, you would find that there is a withdrawal of support from the people to this union of church and state, because the church side of it would be exposed, if you will, to the perils of the fifth plague. And the argument some commentators have made to say, if you can't protect your own self, how can you protect all of us? But in response to that, the church side of that union will now move into a different level, where they will perform miracles almost in similar way to where Elijah dealt with the 450 false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And in doing that, they will eventually create a return of those who had left of the waters, of the people who had disappeared. They would come back together and form an alliance all over again. But that alliance is now going to be very specifically focused on the destruction of God's people. But before that could happen, Christ will come. All right. So that is kind of the sequence that has emerged, if you will, from our study of Revelation um, I would say 12 to 17. And when we get to 18, we will expand another bit further. We will put a microscope on some aspects of that sequence a bit more. And when we get to 19, we'll do that. And when we get to 20, by the time we get to the second half of chapter 19 and 20, we will go a little bit beyond all of that and start to talk about what happens when we get to heaven, final judgment, hell's fire, and Christ establishing a new heaven and a new earth. So that is where we head in as we head towards chapter 22, which is the end of the book of Revelation. Any questions, anybody? I think we've covered a lot today, but it's a culmination of what we've been looking at for the past 3 to 4 weeks. So hopefully, while it's a lot, it's measured, if you will, because it's coming from where we have studied before. Questions? All right, let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for your word. As we study your word today, dear Lord, you have revealed so much, and so much is ahead of us. Let us not become too preoccupied with trying to predict the future and knowing for sure you've given us enough. Let us know that there are some sobering times ahead, but that you are always focused on those who are called, chosen, and faithful. And so we pray today to answer your call, to choose to serve you, and to remain faithful to you. Let your love for us, your death upon Calvary mean something for us. We believe that we can live victorious Christian lives, not to earn salvation, but because we are saved, because you are now leading our lives, you can guide us and direct us. And we pray that we'll always be ready. And as we see the events of the world unfolding in front of us, may we be able to relate them to what we have studied and know that your coming is assured, and that even though people may be afraid, we will be at peace because we know that you are God, who is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and you will burst the clouds of glory one day and lead us into the everlasting life. These are the mercies we do ask in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.